Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I've done this multiple times, but hopefully this is the final take. Compared to my previous videos on Towery, this one's exclusively about ReactJS, particularly the pitfalls of using ReactJS that you can fall into. And in this video, I'll be talking about the differences between useLayoutEffect and useEffect. And as you can see from my blog post over here that I wrote yesterday, the the difference is that you could end up, the pitfall is that you might end up using useLayoutEffect for performance gains in a scenario where it actually hinders performance. Okay? And that's kind of why useEffect should always be used for 99% of things, unless it's very important. But those specific scenarios are always important to me because I'm just that kind of person who nitpicks stuff. But for some background information, I wanted to persist data across children like this, and when home gets dismounted and remounted, I wanted to persist which form was open as well as which tab was here. I was actually implementing this tab thing yesterday, and I wanted to persist which tab was open because it would be kind of annoying if the user's on sequence 2 over here, goes to the main view and comes back and it's on sequence 1 again. That's kind of annoying, don't you agree? So what did I say? I said, okay, I will do it the same way as I was saving the view across the children over here, and I ended up finding some issues with my code, some bugs. I was rendering an extra time, and it was just annoying. It was just horrible. That it was actually a good thing that I figured it out, but it was horrible that it was doing that. And so, where does useLayoutEffect come in? And it basically comes in that I wanted to update a parent's variable inside a child state when inside a child when a child state got updated. So you could argue useLayoutEffect versus useEffect, and I said useLayoutEffect because it doesn't matter about the UI, it doesn't affect the UI, and that's such a pitfall over there. So what is the difference between useLayoutEffect and useEffect? Well, what the docs say, and I will also clarify it, is that useLayoutEffect fires synchronously, and it fires before the DOM gets painted. So synchronous is a before DOM paint. Okay, the contents gets run like that. But if the content is asynchronous, of course, you're not going to notice it. It's just going to fire asynchronous first, compared to useEffect, which fires asynchronously. So it doesn't really matter. And the implications aren't really said, but the implication is that LayoutEffect blocks the DOM paint. Okay, that is a fact. That means the contents of LayoutEffect blocks the paint, especially so and noticeably so if the contents of LayoutEffect is synchronous. When you're making small things with useLayoutEffect, you may doing asynchronous tasks because a lot of the stuff in JavaScript that take up time are almost always asynchronous. So that means that even with useLayoutEffect, you might not notice it. So now I will give some examples. A bad example, before I get into the examples, I want to simplify what useLayoutEffect is. It's a guaranteer. It guarantees something will be done before DOM paint. That something does not really necessarily mean that an entire asynchronous call will get run. It just means that the asynchronous call will get fired if you use asynchronous functions inside useLayoutEffect. But anyways, here is a bad example. Suppose you're a developer who's unethical and are, capturing information your users are doing. You want to spy on them. So you're like, okay, I want to send this information to my server, and whenever the user updates the state called schedule, I will update the stuff, okay? And you're thinking, okay, we're gonna call fetch, and we're gonna send this information to our server over here, okay? And at first glance, you may think, okay, obviously this is I gotta use useLayoutEffect because this information is not going to affect the UI. But that's exactly the point. It's actually the other way around. because the information is not going to affect the UI, you might as well use useEffect because it's asynchronous and it still happens. With useLayoutEffect, that means this fetch gets called before the DOM gets painted. Now, calling fetch is actually an insignificant performance hinderer, so you're not going to notice anything because fetch itself is asynchronous. So because it returns a promise, right? So it's not going to block that much. However, if you were doing in the future, because you made this mistake, and you end up doing long tasks here that are irrelevant to the UI, you end up blocking the UI for no reason. So that's exactly the pitfall that could occur. And so useEffect is better. But suppose it does matter for the UI. And you're thinking, should I use useEffect or should I use LayoutEffect if it matters to the UI? And what happens is that you can see what I've done here. Here are 2 examples of it, or 3 examples. Albeit this example is not perfect, it still characterizes how you can use useLayoutEffect. So anyways, I'll give you what's happening. Local forage.getItem is asynchronous, and so is setItem. And when the user opens a view, this gets fired up because I'm using this custom hook to populate the data from the last save, basically. So I want to ensure that the user sees that data as fast as possible. And since this function is asynchronous, that means there is a difference between useEffect and useLayoutEffect. On the other hand, if this function was synchronous, then it might not actually matter because it's going to block the UI either way. Or it's going to block the UI in useLayoutEffect, and in useEffect, it's just going to delay the population of the form. So then you might use useEffect instead of useLayoutEffect, but since local forage.getItem is asynchronous, and I want to fire this asynchronous call as fast as possible before that, so that the user can see that information as fast as possible, I decided to put it in useLayoutEffect. And this is fetching data for the initial load, okay? And there you go. That's why it's done there. I don't want to show like what's happening, but basically so local forage DOM paint local forage end, right? Finish versus DOM paint local forage and then LF finish, local forage finish, right? Because with useEffect, this could occur, and this occurring would end up, slowing things down because then it's gonna be like 2 arrows over here, whereas over here it's 1 arrow each time. Over here it'll be 2 arrows at the end. So of course this is what I wanted to avoid, which is why I use local forage. By 2 arrows I mean like time wise. If you call local forage later, that means it finishes later, right? So if I call local forage as fast as possible and then the DOM gets painted and then it finishes, then of course it's great. But here we go is another function which I added right recently, is what if the state gets updated, right? Like in my previous example, the state gets updated and you've used LayoutEffect already, and you say, okay, wait a second, local forage at setItem, does this affect the state of the app? No, it doesn't. It's just an update call. It's a callback, okay? And since it's a callback that doesn't affect the UI, I don't want to block it. I don't want to block the main thread. Even though this is asynchronous and it will barely affect performance, it does affect performance, so that's why it's better to use useEffect here. And there you go. That is it. So in conclusion, it's tempting to use or see useLayoutEffect as a way to squeeze performance when the complete opposite is true. It should quite literally be used to guarantee an execution before a DOM paint, and thus it actually ends up blocking the paint. So it ends up being a performance hindrance if we factor in both execution of the contents plus the DOM paint versus only the execution of the content. So that's why both are important. In the next video, I'll be talking about a bigger pitfall, or it's more of a pattern pitfall, which is how to persist how to persist a child's state data between siblings and between even parents, basically. So yeah, I will see you in that one.